The world of magic doesn't end with the turning of a page. Love rises and falls anew, forbidden like poison or blazing like a phoenix's flame. The heroes we thought we knew uncover their hearts once more. So step into the enchantment of emotion and welcome to a world where love is written anew. The decree arrived on a cold, grey morning, the kind that made the world feel like it had stopped breathing. Hermione Granger sat at her small kitchen table in Grimmauld Place, staring at the thick parchment stamped with the Ministry's crimson seal. The words blurred and refocused, but the meaning didn't change. The Reconciliation Marriage Act, a polite name for forced bonds, for tying up the wounds of war with golden chains. Her name stood beside another, Draco Lucius Malfoy. For a moment, she could only laugh, a sharp, breathless sound that didn't reach her eyes. Of all the people in the wizarding world, of all the possible names, his was the one inked beside hers. The parchment trembled in her hands. Anger came first, quick and hot. "They can't be serious," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "They can't think this will fix anything." But they could, and they did. The war had left too many scars, too much distrust. The Ministry's new policy paired Muggleborns with purebloods from tainted families to ensure cooperation, unity, children who symbolized peace. It was political theatre, dressed as progress. And Hermione Granger, war heroine, former head girl, symbol of everything good, was the perfect face for it. Draco Malfoy received the same letter that morning. He didn't read it twice. He stood in the crumbling remains of Malfoy Manor's study, the winter light slanting through cracked windows. The parchment felt heavy, like a verdict. Hermione Granger. He crushed the letter in his fist. There was a bitter poetry to it. The golden girl of the Order, bound to the coward who had failed his family and his cause. The Ministry wanted to humiliate him, to make an example of the Malfoy name. They would call it reparation, justice, balance. But to Draco, it was punishment. And yet, beneath the humiliation, something darker twisted. Guilt. Because deep down he knew, perhaps he deserved this. The ceremony was small, clinical. A few Ministry officials, a magically binding oath, and a pale gold ring that appeared on their fingers when the spell was sealed. Hermione didn't look at him once. Draco didn't speak. Their hands brushed briefly when they signed the registry, and the air between them flared like static. She pulled away as if burned. When it was done, they were led to the house the Ministry had assigned them, a neutral property in Wiltshire, far from either of their worlds. It was charming in a hollow way. Stone walls, ivy climbing the edges, an oak door that creaked when pushed open. Hermione walked through first, her spine straight, her chin high. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Lovely prison," she murmured. Draco gave a humorless smile. "You'll find the decor matches the company." She turned sharply, eyes blazing. "I don't recall asking for your opinion." "And yet," he drawled, "you'll be hearing plenty of it. We're married now, Granger." The word sounded strange in his mouth. Married. Like it didn't belong to either of them. That night, they sat in silence across from each other at the dining table. The candle between them burned low, shadows dancing across their faces. Hermione tried to eat, but her stomach was twisted in knots. Every clink of silverware grated like nails on glass. Finally, she spoke. "We can make this bearable if we establish boundaries." Draco raised an eyebrow. Boundaries. Yes, rules. We don't have to pretend to like each other, but we can at least be civil. He leaned back, expression unreadable. Civil. That's rich, coming from someone who once called me a... He stopped himself, jaw tightening. Fine. Boundaries. What do you suggest, wife? Don't call me that, she said sharply. He smirked. Touched a nerve? She ignored him. We'll divide the space. You take the study and the east bedroom. I'll take the other side. Meals can be separate. Efficient, he said softly. Very Granger of you. Something in his tone, not quite cruel but edged with something sad, made her hesitate. But she said nothing. When she went upstairs later, she found a faint shimmer of magic woven through the hallway. A ward. He was warding his rooms against her. The discovery stung more than she expected, not because she wanted access, but because it made everything feel so final. Downstairs, Draco stood before the window, looking out into the darkness. He could feel her presence moving through the house, light, cautious. Her footsteps reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years. Life. And that made it worse. Because this fragile peace between them wasn't real. It couldn't be. He had seen too much, done too much. Hermione Granger deserved light, and he had long since drowned in shadow. But when he closed his eyes, he could still hear her voice echoing in his head. Firm, controlled, shaking slightly with restrained anger. He wondered fleetingly what it would sound like if she weren't angry. The next morning, she found him in the kitchen, already dressed, reading a profit article with cold disdain. He didn't look up when she entered. "We're on the front page," he said flatly. Her heart sank. The headline was merciless. War hero and former Death Eater united in Ministry's marriage program. Her photograph showed her looking stiff, guarded. His showed nothing but scorn. Hermione's throat tightened. They make it sound like a joke. "It is a joke," Draco replied. "We're the punchline." For a brief second, their eyes met, and for the first time she saw not arrogance, but weariness. The silence between them stretched thin. Hermione finally said softly, "Maybe we don't have to make it worse." Draco's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You think we can make it better?" "I think," she said, her voice trembling, "we can try not to destroy each other." He looked away, his jaw tight. "You overestimate me, Granger." She held his gaze. "Maybe, or maybe you underestimate yourself." Something flickered in his expression then. Confusion, maybe, or fear. He turned sharply, leaving the room without another word. And as the door closed, Hermione realized it had begun. The war between them wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed against the walls until it became another presence in the room. Hermione filled it with movement. She scrubbed the already clean kitchen counters, alphabetized the shelves, rearranged the sitting room until it looked like a photograph from a catalogue. Every task was an excuse not to think, not to feel. Draco, on the other hand, did the opposite. He disappeared into his study and rarely came out. Sometimes she heard the scratch of a quill, sometimes the faint click of a glass being set down too hard. Once, she thought she heard him pacing, long, restless strides that went on for hours. They barely spoke. When they did, it was short, clipped, functional. There was no affection in the air, no warmth, only the bitter echo of what they used to be to each other, enemies bound by circumstance. And yet, something in that silence began to change. It started on a Tuesday. Hermione was in the library, a room she had claimed as her refuge, when she found the stack of books on the corner table. They weren't hers. She glanced at the titles: The History of Magical Law Reformation, Bloodline Magic and Post-War Ethics, Wand Law, The Science of Identity. There was a note tucked beneath them, a single line written in neat, careful script. Thought you might prefer actual research material to the propaganda the ministry publishes. D. Hermione stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even kind. But it wasn't cruel either. She ran her fingers over the paper, uncertain what to feel. Later that evening, she found him in the garden, coat collar turned up against the wind. His breath misted in the cold air. He looked lonely. "You left those books," she said quietly. He didn't turn. "I assumed you'd notice. You always do." "Why?" "Because," he said after a pause, "you're wasting your mind trying to fix a house that doesn't need fixing." The words were barbed but not sharp, more like a truth he couldn't help but throw at her. "Research keeps me focused," she replied evenly. "So does denial," he murmured. Her chest tightened. "What would you know about denial, Malfoy?" He turned then, eyes grey as the winter sky. "Everything." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the girl who had believed in redemption and the boy who didn't think he deserved it. That night, Hermione couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the frost creep across the glass. She thought of his face, tired, haunted. Not the arrogant sneer she remembered from Hogwarts, but something quieter, something human. It unsettled her, because every time she began to hate him again, something broke that rhythm. A word, a glance, a hesitation that reminded her he was more than his past. And that was dangerous. She wasn't supposed to see him that way. Draco noticed her too. Not in the way one notices a stranger in a shared space, but the way one tries not to notice something that feels too alive. She moved through the house like light, quiet, purposeful, warm. Her presence filled the corners he had forgotten existed. Sometimes, late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would hear her humming softly in the next room, a sound so gentle it hurt. It reminded him of the world he no longer belonged to. He told himself it didn't matter. She would never forgive him, and he had no right to ask for it. But when she walked into a room, he always looked up. Always. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky darkened, thunder rumbling like a threat over the fields. The house felt smaller somehow, too small for the space between them. The lights flickered, then went out. Hermione cursed softly under her breath. The wards must have disrupted the wiring again. Draco appeared in the doorway, wand glowing faintly. Typical ministry craftsmanship. She arched a brow. "Are you implying you could do better?" "Obviously." "Then by all means, fix it." He gave her a long, unreadable look before lifting his wand. The light cast sharp shadows across his face, catching the pale line of a scar along his jaw she hadn't noticed before. "You're staring," he said quietly, not looking at her. Hermione flushed. "I wasn't." "You were." She crossed her arms, defensive. "You have a scar. Congratulations on your observation skills." The storm cracked outside, lightning flashing white across the window. Hermione flinched slightly at the sound, not out of fear, but instinct. For a moment, she was back in the war, in the noise and chaos and loss. Draco saw it. Without thinking, he moved closer. "Granger." "I'm fine," she said too quickly, but her voice trembled. The candlelight flickered between them. She stood so close he could see the faint freckles across her cheekbones, the tremor in her lip she was trying to suppress. He wanted, absurdly, to touch her, to remind her she was here, now, safe. But he didn't. He stepped back. The distance hurt more than it should have. "You should get some rest," he said softly. "So should you." "I don't sleep well." She hesitated. "Nightmares?" He looked away. "Memories." Their eyes met again, and in that fragile silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Two people haunted by different ghosts. After that night, something shifted. They still argued, over the smallest things. She accused him of arrogance. He accused her of condescension. But underneath the sharpness, there was something else. A current neither could ignore. Once, during breakfast, their hands brushed, reaching for the teapot. Neither moved away immediately. Later, when he brought her a stack of research notes she'd left in the sitting room, she murmured a quiet, "Thank you." He nodded, but she caught the faintest curve of a smile on his lips as he walked away. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something. And though neither dared to say it aloud, both of them felt it, that slow, dangerous pull between them, a pull that would either heal them or destroy them. That night, Hermione stood at the window again, watching the last of the storm fade into silence. She thought of his voice, quiet, raw, when he had said memories. She thought of how, for the first time since the war ended, she didn't feel entirely alone. And that terrified her, because she had sworn she would never let herself fall again, not for someone broken, not for someone she couldn't trust. But the heart was a stubborn thing. And in the stillness of that house, with the scent of rain still hanging in the air, Hermione Granger realized she was already starting to care. Just a little. And that, more than anything, was what truly frightened her. The next morning began like any other, except that it didn't. The tension in the house had changed, softer around the edges, but heavier somehow, like air right before rainfall. Hermione noticed it the moment she stepped into the kitchen. Draco was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, his posture as rigid as ever, but there was something quieter about him today. His wand rested beside his cup, the prophet unopened. She hesitated at the doorway. "Morning." He glanced up. "Granger." It wasn't cold, not exactly, but not warm either. A neutral truce disguised as indifference. She poured herself tea, trying not to feel his eyes on her as she reached for the sugar. For weeks, they'd moved around each other like wary animals, each step measured, each word chosen carefully to avoid sparks. And yet, no matter how careful they were, the air still burned. "About last night," Hermione said suddenly, surprising herself. Draco's head tilted. "You mean the thunderstorm, or your sudden interest in my scars?" Her cheeks flushed. "Neither. The wards failed. We'll need to adjust them." He smirked faintly. "Of course, practical as ever." "Someone has to be." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Fine. I'll check the perimeter wards. You can handle the internal charms. Try not to blow anything up, Granger." "Funny," she muttered. But as they worked side by side that morning, Draco outside in the brittle winter air, Hermione inside with her wand drawn, murmuring ancient incantations, The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt charged. Every so often she'd glance through the window and see him standing beneath the pale light, focused, the wind tugging at his hair. There was something achingly lonely about him then, a shadow she didn't know how to name. By afternoon, the wards shimmered with new strength, a faint golden glow pulsing along the property's edge. Hermione stepped outside to inspect them. Draco was kneeling near the gate, his hands dusted with frost. "All stable," he said without looking up. "Good." She hesitated. "You didn't have to help." He gave a short laugh, quiet, bitter. "You think I had anything better to do?" "That's not what I meant." His gaze flicked toward her, sharp and unreadable. "Then what did you mean?" Hermione opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't have an answer. For days after that, something fragile began to take shape between them. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. It was more like an uneasy alliance, forged out of necessity and habit. They shared meals sometimes, even exchanged the occasional remark that wasn't drenched in sarcasm. Once, she caught him reading by the fire, not one of his usual law journals or arcane texts, but Pride and Prejudice. The irony made her snort. "Of all the books," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look up. A classic tale of class prejudice and unbearable misunderstandings. Fitting, don't you think? She smiled despite herself. "You're comparing yourself to Mr. Darcy." "Please, Darcy had social grace compared to me." She laughed, and he looked up, really looked. The sound seemed to surprise him. Something in his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to make her heart stumble. The next evening, she found him in the library again. He was staring at the fire, unmoving, the flames throwing golden shadow across his pale face. "You look like you're about to duel your own thoughts," she said gently. He gave a dry chuckle. "They usually win." Hermione hesitated. "You never talk about the war." Draco's eyes flickered. "Neither do you." "I do," she said quietly. "Just not with you." He turned toward her then, his expression unreadable. "Because you think I wouldn't understand?" "Because I know you would," she whispered. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. He stared into the fire again, his jaw tight. "Do you know what it's like to see your name blackened in every headline? To know that no matter what you do, you'll always be the villain?" Hermione's voice was soft. "Yes, but the difference is I stopped caring what they thought." He met her gaze, something raw flickering in his eyes. "You were always allowed to stop caring, Granger. I wasn't." The honesty of it struck her like a physical blow. For a moment, she saw not the proud, polished Malfoy heir, but the boy who had been forced to play both sides of a war he never chose. "Maybe," she said, her throat tight, "you could start now." He laughed, quietly, bitterly. "And what? Pretend the past didn't happen?" "No," she said. "Learn that it doesn't have to define who you are now." He looked at her for a long time. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, "I wish I believed that." Over the next week, Hermione found herself thinking about that conversation more than she wanted to. His voice had lingered with her, the weariness in it, the honesty he tried to hide behind sarcasm. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his hands tightened when he was deep in thought, the rare, unguarded moments when his mask slipped. And sometimes, only sometimes, she caught him watching her too. Once, in the kitchen, Their eyes met over the rim of their teacups. Neither looked away for several heartbeats. The air between them thickened, the world shrinking to the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Hermione was the first to move, setting her cup down too hard. "I'll be in the library." He didn't stop her, but when she reached the doorway, his voice followed her, low and steady. "You don't have to keep running, Granger." She froze. "From what?" He hesitated. "From me." The words struck deep because she didn't know if he was wrong. That night, she dreamed of firelight and grey eyes. When she woke, the air was heavy with rain again. She sat up, heart racing, her pulse still echoing from the dream. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She wasn't supposed to feel anything for him. Not pity, not curiosity. Certainly not this slow, aching pull that made her chest tighten every time he spoke softly. But feelings didn't care for logic. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went downstairs. Draco was in the sitting room, asleep in an armchair, a half-empty glass of fire whiskey beside him. His head was tilted slightly back, hair falling across his forehead. For a long moment, Hermione simply watched him. Without the usual tension in his posture, he looked impossibly young, like the boy he might have been before the world had demanded he become something else. Her hand moved before she could stop it, brushing a stray lock of hair from his face. He stirred, eyes fluttering open, their gazes locked, so close, so quiet. The fire cracked softly between them. Neither spoke, neither moved. Then Hermione pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath uneven. "You were having a nightmare," she murmured. Draco swallowed. "I always am." And for a heartbeat, it felt like the truth had tied them together, fragile, trembling, undeniable. By the time Hermione returned to her room, her heart was pounding. She leaned against the door, whispering to the silence, "This can't happen." But deep down, she knew it already had. The fragile peace between them lasted exactly 5 days. 5 days of quiet breakfasts, brief conversations, and a strange, unspoken gentleness that neither of them could quite explain. Hermione had begun to think, against her better judgment, that perhaps they were learning to coexist. Then, one afternoon, she found the letter. It was on the kitchen table, sealed with the Malfoy crest. The script was elegant, unmistakably old-fashioned. Hermione knew she shouldn't open it, but curiosity, always her greatest flaw, won. Her eyes skimmed the words quickly. "The Wizengamot is reviewing your compliance with the Reconciliation Marriage Act. Given your family's standing, your cooperation will be essential for restoring the Malfoy name. We trust you will ensure Miss Granger's cooperation as well." The parchment crumpled slightly in her hand. The words burned. So that was it. To him, this, she, was still about status, reputation, a transaction. She heard the front door open before she could compose herself. Draco entered, removing his gloves, his usual calm mask in place. "You're reading my mail now." She turned on him, the letter shaking in her grip. "Did you plan to tell me? Or were you just hoping I'd play my part without knowing I'm being used?" He froze. "Used?" "Ensure Miss Granger's cooperation," she spat, quoting the line. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to be spoken about like that? Like I'm just another item in your family's redemption campaign?" Draco's expression flickered, then hardened. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" He stepped closer, voice low. "They're watching me, Hermione. Every move I make, every step outside this house. I can't afford to give them any reason to drag my family back into court. That's your excuse? That you have to protect the Malfoy name? He clenched his fists. It's not about the name. It's about survival. Funny, she said bitterly. I thought survival was something you only cared about when it suited you. The silence that followed was sharp, painful. Draco's jaw tightened. You think I wanted this? He said, his voice low and trembling. You think I wanted to be chained to someone who can barely stand to look at me? Don't flatter yourself, Granger. Her breath hitched, fury and something deeper twisting together. You really are unbelievable. And you, he shot back, still believe the world divides cleanly into right and wrong. You don't know what it's like to live in the grey. I lived through the same war you did, she snapped. Don't you dare pretend you suffered more because you wore the losing colours. His eyes flashed. You think I didn't pay for it? Every day since that trial. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you made the choices you did. The words hung in the air like poison. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Draco's voice dropped to a whisper, so soft she almost didn't hear it. You think I don't replay them every night? Hermione's anger faltered. There was something raw in his eyes, something that looked too much like pain. But before she could speak, he turned and left the room. The slam of his door echoed through the house like a spell gone wrong. The next day was silent again, but this silence felt different, cold, brittle. Hermione tried to bury herself in her research, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. The way his voice had cracked, the look in his eyes before he walked away. By evening, guilt began to claw at her. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe he had too. But guilt, like pride, was a stubborn thing. Neither reached out until the storm came. It began just after midnight. A fierce winter gale, sleet hammering the windows, branches scraping against the roof. Hermione was half asleep when a loud crash jolted her upright. She grabbed her wand and rushed downstairs. The back door had blown open, snow swirling into the hall. The wards must have fractured again. She muttered a spell to seal the door, but before she could finish, she heard footsteps behind her. Draco, barefoot, wand in hand, eyes sharp with alarm. What the hell are you doing down here? The wards failed, she said, breathless. I was fixing them. Alone? I didn't think you'd care. His jaw tightened. You think I want to wake up to find my... He stopped, the word catching in his throat. Find your what? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he took her wand hand gently, guiding it toward the broken latch. You're freezing. I'm fine. He didn't let go. You're not. Their eyes met, the light from their wands casting golden shadow between them. The storm raged outside, but in that narrow space between their breaths, it felt like the world had gone still. Hermione swallowed. You should go back to bed. So should you, he said, but didn't move. Something unspoken lingered there. Fear, maybe, or longing disguised as irritation. Finally, Hermione pulled away. I'll finish this. Go. He hesitated, then turned toward the stairs. But before he disappeared, he said quietly, For what it's worth, I didn't ask for that letter, and I don't want you used for anything. She looked at him, his face half lit by the glow of his wand. There was no arrogance there now, only honesty, terrifying in its simplicity. I know, she said softly. I just didn't want to believe you meant it. Draco's gaze flickered, his mouth tightening as if to speak, Then he simply nodded and left. The next morning, the world was white with snow. Hermione woke to the smell of tea. When she came downstairs, she found a steaming cup waiting for her on the table. No note this time, just the gesture. She smiled faintly. When Draco appeared a few minutes later, she looked up. "Thank you." He shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "You looked like you could use it." "You're terrible at apologies, you know." "I didn't apologize." "I know," she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. "But I heard it anyway." Something flickered in his expression, something that made her chest tighten. That evening they sat by the fire again, not speaking, but the silence felt different now, softer, safer. Hermione watched the flames dance, her thoughts tangled. Every time she told herself to stop caring, he would say something that made it impossible. Every time she thought she understood him, he revealed another shadow. It was maddening. And yet she couldn't look away. Draco, for his part, stole glances at her when he thought she wasn't watching. There was a calmness about her that he found unbearable and addictive at once. He'd spent years trying to forget the war, to erase the parts of himself that still remembered what it meant to feel. But she had a way of pulling those feelings back to life. Maybe that was why she terrified him. When she finally rose to leave, he said quietly, "Granger." She turned. He hesitated, then said, "You were right. About the choices. I made the wrong ones." Her breath caught. "Draco." He shook his head. "Don't. I just needed you to know that I know." And then he looked at her with a kind of weary tenderness that left her unsteady. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she went upstairs, heart pounding, her mind replaying his voice over and over. She had wanted to hate him, needed to, but hate was slipping through her fingers, replaced by something warmer, far more dangerous. That night, lying awake in the dark, Hermione whispered to herself, "You can't fall for him." But she already was. The days grew longer, and the silence between them grew almost companionable. Almost. They'd fallen into a rhythm that neither of them would admit to. Breakfast together, quiet, wordless, but not unpleasant. Afternoons spent in different rooms, though somehow always aware of where the other was. Evenings by the fire, both pretending they weren't waiting for the other to join. Hermione had stopped calling him Malfoy so often. The few times she did, it was out of habit, not malice. And Draco had stopped baiting her quite so sharply. His sarcasm had softened into something like teasing. But beneath all that civility, something else was growing. Slowly, dangerously. One morning, Hermione woke early to find the house blanketed in mist. The world outside looked ghostly, silvered by fog. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the garden, her breath blooming white in the chill air. Draco was already there. He stood near the old willow, wand raised, murmuring softly to a small cluster of floating orbs. They pulsed with faint light, his magic, restrained but elegant. He didn't notice her at first. His focus was absolute, and there was something mesmerizing about it, the grace of his movements, the quiet control. When he finally turned, he startled slightly. "You're up early." "So are you." He gestured at the orbs. The wards fluctuate at dawn, easier to adjust them now. Hermione stepped closer, curiosity lighting her face. "That's incredibly precise magic." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "You sound surprised." "Not surprised," she said softly. "Just impressed." He looked at her, really looked, as if the word itself had taken him off guard. You shouldn't be. Why not? Because you shouldn't forget what I've done with this same magic. The statement hung in the air, heavy as fog. Hermione's chest tightened. Draco, she began, but he cut her off. Don't, he said, voice low. Don't make excuses for me. Not you. She wanted to argue, to tell him people could change, but the pain in his voice silenced her. Instead, she simply said, You're still using it to protect something now. That counts for something. He looked away, his expression unreadable. Maybe, or maybe it's just another form of penance. Hermione wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to make him stop retreating into that guilt that consumed him. But she didn't. The fog pressed around them, the distance between them both unbearable and necessary. That evening, she found him sitting by the fire again, an open book on his lap, untouched. Without asking, she sat across from him. After a long silence, she said, When I was little, I used to think forgiveness was a single act. You say the words, and it's done. But it's not, is it? He glanced up, startled by the softness in her tone. No, it's not. It's a choice you make over and over, she continued. Every day, until it stops feeling like a wound. Draco's voice was quiet, rough. Do you think that ever happens? Hermione met his eyes. I think it can, if you let it. He held her gaze a long time, something flickering behind his stoicism, something close to longing. Maybe one day, he said finally, but not tonight. She nodded, accepting that. For the first time, he didn't look away. The next few days passed uneventfully, or at least that's what Hermione told herself. But everything felt different now. When their hands brushed, passing a cup, reaching for a book, she felt it like a spark beneath her skin. When he laughed, rare and quiet, she felt her chest tighten with something she didn't dare name. And she wasn't the only one. Draco had begun to notice the details about her. The way she chewed her lip when reading. The soft crease that appeared between her brows when she was concentrating. The way she tucked her curls behind her ear when she was nervous. He found himself lingering in rooms longer than he should, just to hear her voice. Once, she caught him watching her. Instead of looking away, he said simply, You think too much. She smiled faintly. And you don't think enough. He smirked. Maybe we balance each other out. It was meant as a joke, but the air stilled after he said it. They both knew it wasn't entirely untrue. The balance shattered 2 nights later. Hermione had gone into the village to meet a ministry official overseeing the marriage program. The conversation had been infuriating. Bureaucratic nonsense about public image and maintaining appearances. When she returned home, cold and tired, she found Draco waiting by the door, his expression tight. Where were you? She blinked. Excuse me? You left without saying anything. I didn't think I needed to. You always tell me when you go into town. Hermione frowned. Are you keeping track of me now? His tone sharpened. I was concerned. Concerned, she repeated slowly, or controlling. Draco's mouth tightened. Don't twist my words. You're the one twisting mine. I went to meet an official about our situation, Draco. Not that it's any of your business. Of course it's my business, he snapped. You think I don't know what the ministry's like? They'll use anything we say against us. I can handle them, she said, her voice rising. I've been handling them since the war ended. I know you can, he said, softer now. That's what terrifies me. The sudden honesty disarmed her. What? He stepped closer, eyes burning. "You're too brave for your own good, Hermione. You keep walking into danger as if you're untouchable. I've seen what happens to people like that." Her heart pounded. "You don't get to care about what happens to me." He exhaled sharply. "Too late for that." The words hung in the air, raw and bare. Hermione stared at him, her breath catching. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't what?" "Say things you don't mean." His eyes softened. "I mean every word." Silence. Only the sound of rain tapping the window. He took another step closer, and for a dizzying moment, Hermione didn't move. His hand hovered near her face, trembling slightly, as though he were afraid to cross the final inch. She closed her eyes, just for a second. But that second was enough. He touched her cheek, gently, tentatively. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't even a promise. Just a touch. A confession in silence. Then, just as quickly, he dropped his hand, stepping back as though burned. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "That was—" "Don't," she said again, barely above a whisper. He turned away, shoulders rigid, and left the room without another word. Hermione stood there for a long time, heart pounding, the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, vulnerable, unguarded, haunted. What terrified her most wasn't the memory of his touch. It was the way she had wanted him not to stop. Because somewhere between the anger, the guilt, and the silence, something fragile and real had begun to bloom, and it was too late to deny it. For the first time, Hermione Granger was afraid. Not of him, but of herself. The morning after the almost touch was a careful one. Every motion, every word seemed wrapped in layers of restraint. Hermione moved about the kitchen like a ghost, deliberate, noiseless. Draco lingered by the window, tea cooling in his hand, pretending to read the prophet that he had not turned a single page of. Neither mentioned what had happened the night before. Neither dared. The memory hung between them, fragile as glass. One wrong word, one glance too long, and it might shatter completely. When Hermione finally spoke, her voice was quiet. The ministry owl came. He didn't look up. "And they're sending an inspector next week, someone from the Department of Reconciliation." Draco gave a short, humorless laugh. "To make sure the prisoners are content in their gilded cage." Hermione ignored the bitterness. "We'll have to pretend." He looked up then, eyes narrowing. "Pretend what, exactly?" "That we're content." For a moment, his mouth quirked, not quite a smile. "You think we can manage that?" "We'll have to," she said. "I refuse to give them the satisfaction of seeing us fail." That, at least, made him smile. An honest, fleeting one that startled her with its warmth. "There's the Gryffindor in you again, charging into impossible battles." "And there's the Slytherin," she countered, "always underestimating me." They began to rehearse without saying they were rehearsing. Small things at first. A shared breakfast where they forced themselves to speak naturally. A walk through the garden, side by side, but careful not to brush against one another. Once, he poured her tea before she could reach the pot. She said, "Thank you," too quickly, and he looked away, a faint colour rising in his cheeks. They were learning each other's rhythms, the quiet choreography of proximity. It was maddening and intoxicating all at once. On the third day of their uneasy truce, Hermione found him in the study. He was standing before the old piano near the window, fingers hovering above the keys. "You play?" she asked. He startled then straightened. Used to. Why did you stop? He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed one key. The note hung in the air, soft and haunting. Because it reminded me of my mother, he said finally. Hermione's heart softened. She loved music. He nodded once. She said it was the only thing that made the manor feel alive. After the war, I couldn't bear the sound of it. She stepped closer. You could try again. He looked at her, skeptical. Music doesn't belong to the past, she said gently. It belongs to whoever needs it. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sat, fingers trembling slightly as they found the keys. The melody that followed was slow, tentative, but beautiful, full of longing. Hermione stood beside him, listening, the ache in every note winding around her heart. When he stopped, she whispered, "It's lovely." He didn't look up. It hurts. Sometimes the things that hurt are the ones that heal. He gave a quiet, broken laugh. You really believe that? I have to, she said. Otherwise, the war would have meant nothing. He turned his head then, his face only inches from hers. You still think everything can be fixed, don't you? Her eyes met his. No, she said softly, but I think you can be. The silence that followed was unbearable. He could smell the faint scent of her hair, the warmth of her breath. For a heartbeat, he forgot everything. The laws, the guilt, the walls between them, and simply wanted. Then he stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. We should practice for the inspector, he muttered. Hermione exhaled shakily. Right. The week passed in fragments. They practiced civility until it almost felt real. She caught herself laughing at his dry humor. He found himself watching her read by the fire, the way her lips moved silently over each word. But the tension never disappeared. It only deepened. At night, they passed each other in the hall, both pretending not to notice how their shoulders almost touched. Draco began to dream of her voice. Hermione began to dread the mornings, because each one reminded her that the distance between them still existed. The day of the inspection arrived with bright, deceptive sunlight. Hermione wore soft blue, Draco his customary black. When the knock came, they were already standing side by side, the picture of composure. The inspector, a sharp-eyed witch named Rowena Bryce, looked them over like a specimen under glass. Mr. Malfoy, Mrs. Malfoy. Hermione's pulse skipped at the title. Draco, of course, showed no reaction. Bryce's smile was polite but empty. We're simply here to ensure that the program is fostering unity between our citizens. Unity, Draco echoed dryly. What a lovely word for captivity. Hermione shot him a warning look, then forced a pleasant tone. You'll find we've adjusted well, Madam Bryce. The inspector's gaze flicked between them. So, I see. And tell me, how do you spend your days together? Hermione launched into a description of shared routines, her voice steady even as her mind screamed that this was all theatre. Draco added a few carefully chosen words, his drawl smooth as silk. To anyone listening, they sounded believable, comfortable even. Then Bryce said, "A genuine connection can't be fabricated. Sometimes it shows in the smallest things." She smiled thinly. "May I see it?" Hermione froze. "See? What?" "Your connection," the woman said, eyes gleaming. "A gesture. Something simple." Draco's glance met hers, a silent question. Hermione's throat tightened. She gave the smallest nod. He reached for her hand. His fingers brushed hers lightly, then laced through. The touch was electric. The inspector smiled, satisfied. Very convincing. If she noticed the tremor in Hermione's hand or the flicker in Draco's expression, she didn't comment. When Bryce finally left, closing the door behind her, Hermione released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Draco didn't let go immediately. Their joined hands hung between them, still warm. Finally, he whispered, "You're trembling." "So are you," she replied. He dropped her hand as if it burned. "We fooled her." Hermione turned away. "That's what we were supposed to do." But her voice wasn't steady. Later, she stood by the window, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The memory of his touch still burned against her skin. Draco appeared in the doorway. "They'll leave us alone now," he said quietly. "Until the next inspection." "Probably." She looked at him then, her voice trembling between anger and something else. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" He hesitated. "Every day." "Then why keep doing it?" "Because if I stop," he said, "I won't be pretending anymore." Her heart stuttered. "And what would that mean?" Draco's eyes met hers, grey and unreadable. "It means I'd have to admit what this is." She swallowed hard. "And what is it?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I don't know," he said softly, "but it terrifies me." Hermione's pulse thundered. "You're not the only one." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Draco reached up, slowly, hesitantly, and tucked a curl behind her ear. It was the gentlest touch imaginable, and yet it felt like the world shifted around them. He let his hand fall. "Good night, Hermione." Her name, spoken like that, was almost a promise. She whispered, "Good night." But when he left the room, her knees nearly gave way, because she knew now that there was no pretending left. Not really. Whatever this was between them, it had become real, and there was no turning back. The days after the inspection felt unreal, as if the house itself had shifted. The walls seemed to hum softly with unspoken words, and the silence between them had become too heavy to ignore. Hermione found herself listening for his footsteps, the creak of the stair, the rustle of a book page from his study. Each small sound reminded her he was near, too near. And yet, she didn't move away. Draco had started taking tea with her every morning, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Neither of them mentioned it. They simply sat together, two reluctant allies who had forgotten when their truce began to feel like routine. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not the way he used to, cold and judgmental, but with quiet curiosity, as if he were trying to memorize her. Every time their eyes met, he looked away too quickly, the ghost of a blush creeping across his pale cheeks. It should have been easy to pretend she didn't notice. But she did. And worse, she found herself doing the same. One evening, as rain whispered against the windows, Hermione lingered by the fire with a book open in her lap. Draco sat at the other end of the couch, pretending to read as well, though his eyes hadn't moved across the page for the better part of an hour. When thunder rolled, she flinched, just slightly. He noticed. "Still afraid of storms, Granger?" She looked up sharply. "I'm not afraid." He tilted his head, smirking. "You jumped." "I was startled." He set his book aside. "Startled, terrified. It's all the same thing." Hermione's lips twitched despite herself. "You're insufferable. Old habits die hard." She shook her head, smiling faintly, and returned to her book. But she could feel him watching her again. The air between them seemed alive with electricity, not unlike the lightning outside. Minutes passed before he spoke again, softer this time. "You never told me what happened during the war." Her breath caught. "You already know what happened." "I know what the prophet wrote. I know what everyone whispered, but I don't know what it was like for you." Hermione hesitated. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, steady, waiting. "I don't like talking about it," she said finally. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But sometimes not talking is worse." She looked into the fire. The memory of screams and shattered stone flickered with the flames. "It wasn't the fighting that was hardest," she said quietly. "It was after. When the war ended, everyone thought peace would fix everything. But peace is quieter. It leaves space for the memories to echo." Draco didn't respond for a long moment. Then he said, "I know the sound of those echoes." She turned to him, surprised by the honesty in his tone. He was staring into the fire, his face unreadable. "Every night I see faces, hear voices, people I couldn't save, people I didn't try to save." Hermione's chest tightened. "You were a child," she said softly. "I was old enough to make choices," he murmured. "Old enough to stand by and watch." Without thinking, she reached for him. Her hand brushed his, tentative, trembling. He looked down at the touch as though it was something foreign, something dangerous. "Draco," she whispered, "you can't change what happened." "No," he said, his voice cracking, "but I can regret it every day for the rest of my life." The rain outside grew heavier, the rhythm filling the silence. Hermione didn't pull her hand away, and for a moment, just one, he turned his palm, letting his fingers curl around hers. It was the first time they had touched willingly. After that night, something between them cracked open. Not fully, just enough to let the light through. They began to talk more. About small things at first, books, spells, the garden, until those conversations bled into deeper ones. They laughed sometimes softly, as though they didn't trust the sound. And sometimes, in those quiet moments, Hermione would catch herself forgetting who he used to be. One afternoon, she found him kneeling in the garden, his sleeves rolled up, dirt smudged across his hands. "You," she said, smiling in disbelief. "Gardening?" He glanced up. "Don't look so shocked, Granger. I'm perfectly capable of manual labor." "I didn't say you weren't," she teased, "but I didn't think you'd want to." He shrugged. "It's grounding." The word lingered between them. Hermione knelt beside him without thinking. "You missed a weed," she said, pointing to a stubborn patch of green. He arched an eyebrow. "I was saving it for you." "You're impossible." "So I've been told." Their hands brushed as they reached for the same sprig, and she froze. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a shiver through her. She pulled back too quickly, nearly toppling into the soil. Draco caught her arm before she could fall, steadying her. "Careful," he said, his voice low, his fingers firm around her wrist. For one breathless second, she forgot how to speak. The scent of earth and rain surrounded them, and his eyes, grey, uncertain, searched hers like he was looking for permission to stay in that moment. Hermione swallowed hard. "Thank you," she managed. He released her slowly. "You really should watch your footing." Her lips curved faintly. "You really should stop trying to save me." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't think I could." That evening, Hermione couldn't focus on her book. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the rawness in his expression, the warmth of his hand against her skin. She told herself it was nothing. Just a moment, just proximity and gratitude. But her heart refused to listen. She was falling, slowly and unwillingly, for the man she'd spent years trying to hate. And Draco, though he tried to hide it, was falling too. He didn't recognize it at first. He told himself it was guilt, habit, the illusion of comfort. But then he would hear her laughter from another room, or see the way her brow furrowed when she was lost in thought, and the truth hit him with quiet violence. He wanted her, not out of obligation, not out of redemption, but because she made him feel alive. One night, unable to sleep, Draco found himself standing outside her door. He told himself he just needed to speak to her, about the ministry, about the warding charms, about anything that wasn't her. He knocked softly. The door opened and Hermione blinked at him, half asleep, curls spilling around her shoulders. She wore a loose jumper, her expression unguarded. Draco. He almost turned around. Almost. I couldn't sleep, he said instead. She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come in. The room smelled faintly of lavender and parchment. He hesitated, then sat at the edge of the chair near her bed. They didn't speak for a while. The silence wasn't awkward, just heavy with everything they didn't know how to say. Finally, Hermione whispered, "You don't have to carry it alone, you know." He looked up sharply. Carry what? The guilt, the past. It's not yours to hold forever. He shook his head. You think it's that easy? No, she said. I think it's possible. He laughed quietly, the sound brittle. You really do believe in fixing broken things, don't you? I've seen people come back from worse, she said. His gaze softened. And what about you? Who fixes you, Hermione? The question caught her off guard. I don't need fixing. He leaned forward slightly. Everyone does. The space between them felt smaller than it was. Hermione's heart raced. You should go, she whispered. He nodded, but didn't move. You're right. Still, for a moment longer, he stayed there, eyes locked with hers, the air trembling with what neither dared to name. Then, finally, he stood. Good night. She didn't answer until he was gone, and when she did, it was barely a breath. Good night, Draco. But the word Draco lingered in the air, fragile and forbidden, like a secret she no longer wanted to keep. Hermione awoke to pale winter sunlight spilling across her bed, the light crisp and cold. The house was quiet, but she could sense him, the faint echo of movement downstairs, the soft clink of glass against wood. She lay still for a moment, trying to still her heartbeat. The memory of his voice the night before lingered, low, unguarded, almost tender. She hadn't meant to let him in, not even for a moment. But he'd come anyway, gently, like a draft through a cracked door, and she hadn't stopped him. When she entered the kitchen, Draco was there, already dressed, sleeves rolled up, steam curling from his mug. He looked up when she entered, eyes flicking to hers, then away again, too quickly. Morning, she said softly. He nodded. Morning. The air between them was taut, humming with the memory of everything unspoken. She poured herself tea and tried to act normal, though her hands trembled slightly. They sat in silence, the clock ticking too loudly. Finally, she said, We need more flu powder and ink. I'll go into town after lunch. I'll come with you. Hermione blinked. You don't have to. I know. His gaze stayed on his mug. But I want to. She hesitated, then nodded. All right. They apparated to the edge of the Wiltshire village, where cobbled streets wound between crooked shops. The air smelled faintly of rain and smoke. A few people recognized Hermione and nodded politely, then noticed Draco beside her and froze. The whispers began almost instantly. Hermione felt them like pinpricks along her skin, but when she looked at him, he walked straight ahead, head high, face impassive. As they stepped into the apothecary, she murmured, "You don't have to ignore them. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "It's better than what I used to deserve." Her throat tightened. "You're not that person anymore." He didn't answer. When they left, she noticed his hands were clenched into fists inside his pockets. Without thinking, she reached out, brushed his sleeve. "Draco," she said quietly. "They don't matter." He stopped walking. "You matter." The words came out before he could stop them, raw, stripped of all the careful armor he usually wore. Hermione froze, heart pounding. "Draco." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw it, all of it. The fear, the longing, the guilt tangled into one unbearable truth. "I shouldn't have said that," he murmured. "No," she whispered. "You shouldn't." But her voice trembled, and that tremor gave her away. He stepped closer, slowly, as if giving her every chance to turn away. "Tell me to stop." Hermione's breath hitched. "I can't." The space between them disappeared. His hand lifted, hesitant, and brushed against her jaw, light as a spell. Then, for one fragile moment, he kissed her. It was nothing like she'd imagined it might be. Not desperate, not wild. It was hesitant, aching, as if both were afraid to breathe and break it. The world narrowed to the warmth of his mouth, the tremor in his hand against her cheek, the sound of her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs. When he pulled back, the look on his face broke her. "I'm sorry," he said, voice barely audible. "I had no right." She swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "You didn't." He nodded once, turning away before she could see the pain that flashed across his features. Hermione didn't stop him. She couldn't. Because the worst part wasn't that he'd kissed her. It was that she'd kissed him back. They didn't speak on the way home. The silence between them was no longer empty, but thick, pulsing with confusion and guilt. When they apparated back to the house, Draco muttered something about the wards and disappeared into his study. Hermione stood in the hall, the air still charged with the echo of what had happened. She wanted to be angry, with him, with herself, with the world that had forced them together in the first place. But all she could feel was exhaustion. That night, she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Her lips still burned with the ghost of his. Draco sat in the dark of his study, staring at the untouched glass of fire whiskey on his desk. The taste of her still haunted him. The warmth, the hesitation, the way she hadn't pulled away until he had. He hated himself for it. He had sworn never to drag her into his shadows, never to make her part of the mess that was his life. And yet, the moment she'd looked at him like he wasn't beyond redemption, he'd fallen apart. He pressed his palms to his eyes, the ache behind them sharp. "You fool," he thought. "You absolute fool." But when he closed his eyes, he saw her, the strength in her, the fire that hadn't gone out even after everything. And he realized that for the first time in years, he wanted something he wasn't sure he deserved. Peace. Not from the ministry, not from his past, from her. The next morning, Hermione found him in the garden again. The frost had settled overnight, the world crystalline and still. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, his expression carefully neutral. "About yesterday," she began. He shook his head. "You don't need to say anything." "Yes, I do." She stepped closer. "We can't pretend it didn't happen." "I wasn't planning to." That startled her. "You weren't?" "No." He exhaled a cloud of breath in the cold air. "I've spent most of my life pretending. I'm tired of it." "Then what are we supposed to do?" she whispered. He met her eyes, something fierce and fragile in his gaze. "Whatever we do, I won't lie about what I feel." Her heart skipped. "Draco, this isn't simple. The ministry—" "Let them watch," he interrupted. "Let them judge. I don't care." "You should," she said, voice trembling. "Because I do." He flinched slightly, then nodded. "I know." Hermione closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. "This can't work. We're too different, too damaged." "Maybe," he said quietly, "but maybe that's why it could." Her breath hitched. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said, stepping closer until she could see the faint tremor in his jaw. "I don't know what this is, Hermione, but I can't go back to pretending I don't feel it." Her resolve cracked like thin ice. "You make everything too complicated." He gave a faint smile. "You make everything worth it." And before she could stop herself, she kissed him again. This time, it wasn't hesitant. It was fierce, desperate, a release of everything she'd tried to hold back. His hands came up to her face, her hair, as though he'd been waiting his entire life for this one fragile moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Hermione rested her forehead against his chest. "This changes everything," she whispered. "It was already changing," he murmured. She let out a trembling breath, eyes closing. "Then maybe we stop fighting it." Draco's arms tightened around her, the faintest sigh escaping him, part relief, part disbelief. "You're going to ruin me, Granger." She smiled faintly against his chest. "Maybe we'll ruin each other." And for the first time since the war, neither of them felt broken, just uncertain, human, alive. For the first time since the war, the house felt alive. Not because of spells or ministry wards, but because something had finally shifted between them. Fragile, dangerous, real. Hermione could feel it in the way the air hummed when he was near, the way his voice softened when he said her name. There was still so much between them. History, guilt, the weight of everything unspoken. But there was something else now too. Something that made her chest ache and her mind race. She should have been terrified, and she was. But she also couldn't stop smiling when she caught his reflection in the window, or when his hand brushed hers by accident, and neither of them moved away. The next morning, Hermione found Draco in the kitchen, hair disheveled, sleeves rolled, trying to make tea. A faint line of steam rose from the kettle, curling around him like a veil. "You're awake early," she said. He looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Couldn't sleep." "Nightmares?" "Not this time." His eyes lingered on her. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. He poured 2 cups, setting one in front of her. "About how strange this is." Hermione tilted her head. "Strange?" He met her gaze. "That you're here, that I want you to be." Her heart skipped. "Draco." He raised a hand. I know what you're going to say. It's impossible. It's reckless. It's not supposed to happen." She exhaled shakily. "You're right." He gave a wry smile. And yet, here we are. She looked away, focusing on the tea. You make it sound simple. It's not. Nothing with us ever is. There was a moment of silence. Then Hermione said quietly, "We'll have to be careful. If the Ministry suspects anything beyond the contract, they'll make it their business," he finished grimly. "They always do." But he didn't sound afraid, only resigned. That afternoon they worked side by side in the library. Hermione was annotating a set of old Ministry papers. Draco was transfiguring a broken chair leg, though she could tell his focus was more on her than the spell. When she looked up, she caught him staring. "What?" she asked, trying to sound annoyed. He smirked. "You furrow your brow when you're thinking too hard." "I do not." "You do. It's rather endearing." Her cheeks warmed. "You're impossible." He shrugged. "So, I've been told." She tried to go back to her work, but her pulse betrayed her. Every inch of her skin felt aware of him. The quiet rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of parchment and cedar that clung to his clothes. When she finally looked up again, his eyes hadn't left her. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Memorizing you." Her throat went dry. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because I've spent most of my life trying to forget the things I felt. I don't want to forget this." That night, a letter arrived from the Ministry. The wax seal glowed faintly green. Official business. Hermione's stomach sank as she read. A formal review. A hearing to evaluate the success of their union. It was scheduled in 3 weeks. Draco read the letter over her shoulder. "They'll be looking for cracks. They'll be looking for proof," she said softly. "Proof that the program works. In other words, proof that we're believable." Hermione folded the parchment, her hands shaking. "We can handle that. We have to." He studied her, expression unreadable. "You're afraid. I'm realistic. You're both." She met his gaze, her voice trembling. "If they think this isn't real, they'll separate us." Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, but also something fierce beneath it. "Then we'll make them believe." The way he said it, quiet, certain, made her chest tighten. Because the thought of losing him now felt like losing the air she breathed. Over the next days, their fragile intimacy deepened in small, unexpected ways. He began to help her in the kitchen, even though his attempts at cooking were disastrous. She laughed for the first time in months when he nearly set the pan on fire, and he stood there, frozen, watching her laugh like it was a spell he didn't want to end. At night, they read by the fire together. Sometimes he would fall asleep in the chair beside her, and she'd quietly drape a blanket over him before slipping away. Once, she woke to find him standing in the hall outside her door. He didn't explain, and she didn't ask. He simply whispered, "I wanted to make sure you were all right," before disappearing into the shadows again. But the closer they grew, the more Hermione felt the weight of it pressing on her. She had fought too long, lost too much, to let herself need someone, least of all him. And yet, when he looked at her that way, when he said her name like it was something precious, she couldn't remember why she was supposed to keep her distance. One evening, she found him outside, standing by the edge of the property, staring at the horizon. The sky was deep indigo, the first stars trembling into view. "You always stand out here when something's bothering you," she said. He didn't turn. "I didn't realize you were keeping track." "I notice things." "So do I," he said quietly. She stepped closer, the wind tugging at her hair. "What is it this time?" He hesitated. "The hearing. We'll get through it." "I know." He turned to face her, his eyes shadowed. "But what happens after?" She frowned. "After? When the contract ends. When the ministry decides they've proved their point and we go back to our separate lives." Hermione froze. She hadn't let herself think that far ahead. "I don't know." He gave a hollow laugh. "You'll go back to your world, your friends, your work, your peace, and I'll go back to mine. What's left of it." "Draco." "It's fine," he said quickly, but his voice trembled. "I always knew this wasn't meant to last." She stepped closer, her words fierce and unsteady. "Don't you dare decide that for me." He looked startled. "Hermione!" "You don't get to decide what this means, or when it ends. You don't get to walk away before we've even begun." He stared at her, the mask slipping. "You think this is easy for me? You think I haven't spent every day wondering when you'll wake up and realize you deserve better than this?" Her eyes glistened. "And you think I haven't spent every day wishing you'd stop punishing yourself long enough to see that you're not the man you were?" Silence fell, sharp and shattering. Draco took a slow, unsteady breath. "I don't know how to be what you need." She shook her head. "I don't need perfect. I need honest." And for the first time, he didn't run. He reached for her, hands trembling, and pulled her close, not with urgency, but with something deeper, the kind of touch that said, "I'm here, even when I don't know how to be." Hermione rested her forehead against his chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "You make me feel like there's still something worth fighting for," she whispered. He closed his eyes, his voice barely audible. "Then maybe that's what we are, the fight after the war." And as the stars burned above them, their hands found each other, not as enemies, not as victims of circumstance, but as two souls finally daring to hope that love, even born from ruin, could still be real. The days leading up to the hearing passed like the calm before a storm, deceptively quiet, yet charged with tension. Outside, winter had settled deep into the fields, the frost thick on the ground. Inside, the house hummed with unease. Hermione had taken to pacing the library at night, papers and parchments spread across the desk like a battlefield. Draco watched her from the doorway more than once, unseen, a faint ache stirring in his chest every time she bit her lip in concentration. It wasn't just the hearing that kept them awake. It was everything that had built between them. The words left unsaid, the touches that lingered too long, the knowledge that after all this time they were standing on the edge of something neither of them had planned for. One night, when sleep refused to come, Hermione found herself walking down the corridor, her steps leading her, as they always did, to his study. The door was ajar and a dim light spilled through. He was sitting at his desk, head bowed over a letter. A fire burned low behind him, painting his profile in golden shadow. He looked older in that light, not tired, but worn. "Draco!" He looked up, startled. Then, seeing her, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "Can't sleep either." She shook her head. "You?" "I wasn't trying." She hesitated. "You're writing again." He glanced down at the parchment, then folded it carefully. "It's nothing." "Who is it for?" He gave a wry half-smile. "A habit I can't seem to break. Writing to people I'll never send letters to." Hermione stepped closer, curiosity softening her voice. Your mother? His eyes flickered. Sometimes. He hesitated, then added, sometimes to you. The air shifted. Hermione's breath caught. To me? He looked down, voice quiet. It's easier to write to you than to talk to you. On parchment, you don't look at me like I'm something you're still trying to forgive. Her heart clenched. Draco. He cut her off gently. Don't. You don't have to say anything. I just needed to tell you. She stood there for a moment, the fire crackling softly between them. Then she said, You're wrong. I forgave you a long time ago. He looked at her sharply. Why? Because I saw who you became, she said simply, not who you were. Something broke in his expression, a flicker of disbelief, of hope, of grief. You shouldn't forgive me, but I did. Their eyes met, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then, slowly, he rose from the chair, closing the distance between them. You make it sound so simple, he murmured. It's not, she said, but it's right. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly over her wrist, a hesitant touch that sent a shiver down her spine. You shouldn't be this kind. Maybe kindness is what you needed all along. He exhaled, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. You're going to be the end of me, Granger. Maybe you were already halfway there, she whispered. For a moment, he looked as though he might kiss her again, but instead, he stepped back. We should get some rest. Tomorrow we start preparing. She nodded, though her pulse was still racing. Tomorrow. But when she lay in bed that night, sleep did not come. His words echoed through her mind, letters unsent, forgiveness undeserved, and somewhere deep inside, she knew. She was already his, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the house felt colder. Hermione dressed carefully, her mind already spinning with everything they needed to prepare. Documents, testimonies, the details of their life together that the ministry would demand to see. When she entered the dining room, Draco was already there, reading through a pile of parchment. His hair fell into his eyes. There was a faint bruise of exhaustion beneath them. You've been up all night, she said. He didn't look up. Couldn't stop thinking. About the hearing? About us. Her heart stumbled. Draco. He finally looked at her then, and the rawness in his expression silenced her. I need to know something before we stand in that room and play their game. When they ask if this marriage means anything, if it's more than politics. I need to know if I'm lying. The words hit her like a spell. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. He stood, moving closer, his voice low. I won't make you say it if you don't want to, but I can't walk in there pretending if you don't feel it too. Hermione swallowed hard. It's not that simple. It is, he said softly. It's the simplest thing in the world. Her voice shook. I'm terrified. So am I. And just like that, the walls between them cracked again. She took a step closer. This wasn't supposed to happen. I know. I hated you, she whispered. He gave a faint, broken smile. You weren't alone in that. And now, he cut her off gently. Now you don't. No, she said, the word trembling. Now I don't. He exhaled, the sound ragged. Then I'm not lying. Before she could speak, he leaned forward and their lips met again, slower this time, deeper. There was no confusion, no hesitation, just two people who had spent too long denying what had been growing between them. When they finally broke apart, Hermione's hands were still tangled in his shirt, his breath hot against her skin. She whispered, "We'll convince them." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We'll convince ourselves first." The day of the hearing arrived. The ministry's grand hall was crowded with reporters, officials, and too many familiar faces. Hermione felt her pulse thrum as they entered. Draco beside her, calm and composed, the picture of pure blood dignity. But when his hand brushed hers, she felt the faint tremor there, and it steadied her somehow. The questions came quickly, formalities at first, then sharper, more personal. Was the union genuine? Did you live together as a couple? Do you share affection? Every word was a test, every look a trap. Hermione answered carefully, but the officials weren't satisfied. Finally, one of them, a smug wizard in green robes, leaned forward. "Forgive my bluntness, Mrs. Malfoy, but many still doubt this match. Can you honestly claim there is love between you?" The word love hit the air like a challenge. Hermione froze. Her mind raced. This was the moment. Then Draco spoke. "Yes." All heads turned toward him. His voice was steady, but his eyes were locked on hers. "You can doubt my motives, my past, everything else, but not this. I love her." The hall erupted in murmurs. Hermione's heart pounded so violently she thought she might collapse. The official raised an eyebrow. "And you, Mrs. Malfoy, do you share those feelings?" For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then Hermione reached for Draco's hand. "Yes," she said softly. "I do." The murmurs died instantly. For the first time since the decree that bound them, neither of them was pretending. And when they left the courtroom, hand in hand, the world outside felt a little less cold. That night, back in their quiet house, Hermione stood by the window, staring out into the snow. Draco came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, feeling his heartbeat steady against her spine. "You meant it," she said quietly. He pressed his forehead to her hair. "Every word." "Then so did I." They stayed like that, in silence, as snow drifted softly against the glass. Enemies no longer, not by law, not by circumstance, but by choice, together. And for the first time, the future didn't frighten either of them. The morning after the hearing dawned pale and still, a kind of hush resting over the house. Outside, snow had fallen in the night, laying a clean white silence over everything. Hermione stood at the window, wrapped in one of Draco's spare sweaters, watching the light crawl over the frosted fields. For the first time in months, she felt as though she could breathe. The hearing had gone better than either of them could have hoped. No accusations, no threats, no ministry edicts hanging over their heads. The officials had left satisfied, convinced that the pairing of Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger was not only stable, but genuine. But what haunted her now was not the relief. It was the truth that had brought them there. He had said it without hesitation. "I love her." And she had said it back. The words had felt both foreign and inevitable, slipping out like something that had always been waiting beneath her skin. Now, in the cold light of morning, she wasn't sure what scared her more, that she'd meant it, or that he had too. Draco found her in the kitchen an hour later, pouring tea she didn't drink. "You're quiet," he said, stepping into the room. "I'm thinking." "Dangerous habit, that," he murmured, and she smiled faintly despite herself. He leaned against the counter, studying her. The dark circles beneath his eyes hadn't faded, but there was something lighter in his face now, a cautious peace. You didn't sleep, she observed. Neither did you. I didn't have nightmares, she admitted softly. Just dreams. Good ones. She looked down into her cup. I don't know yet. He hesitated, then said, About yesterday. Don't. She cut him off too quickly, too sharply. Don't make it smaller by explaining it. He blinked. I wasn't going to. Hermione turned, surprised by his calm tone. I meant what I said, he told her quietly. Every word. I know, she whispered. Then why do you look like you're trying to undo it? Because, she said, voice shaking, I don't know what comes next. He took a step closer. Neither do I, but for once, I don't care. She looked up then, meeting his gaze, and saw the boy he had been, proud, frightened, lost, and the man he was becoming. She didn't know when pity had turned to understanding, or when understanding had turned to this impossible, dangerous tenderness. But it was there, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. When his hand brushed hers, she didn't pull away. The rest of the day passed quietly. The snow thickened, muting every sound, and the fire burned low and steady. They stayed near each other without needing to fill the silence. In the afternoon, Hermione sat by the window with a book she wasn't reading. Draco was at the piano again, his fingers tracing a melody so soft it barely touched the air. You're playing again, she said. He didn't look up. I can't seem to stop. It suits you, he laughed quietly. You think anything suits me. Not everything, she said, smiling. But this does. He stopped playing, turning toward her. And you? What about me? What suits you, Hermione? She thought for a moment, then said, Peace. Draco's expression softened. You deserve it. She tilted her head. So do you. Maybe I only deserve it because of you. She met his eyes, her voice quiet. You don't need me to be good, Draco. He gave a faint, crooked smile. Maybe not, but you make me want to be. Her heart clenched, and before she could answer, the clock chimed softly in the hall, breaking the spell. That night, the world disappeared beneath snow. The sky was heavy and white, and the wind howled against the windows. Hermione sat curled in an armchair by the fire, a blanket around her shoulders. Draco entered the room silently, carrying 2 glasses of wine. Celebratory, he said, handing her one. For what? For surviving another ministry ordeal without hexing anyone. She laughed, really laughed, the sound bright and soft at once. He watched her, something warm flickering in his eyes. Don't look at me like that, she murmured. Like what? Like you're memorizing me again. He smiled faintly. You caught me. They drank in silence for a while. The fire crackled, the snow pressed against the windows, and the air between them felt thick with all the things they hadn't said. Finally, Hermione set her glass down. Do you ever think about before? He looked up. Before the war? Yes. Every day, he said. But less lately. Because of this? Because of you, he said simply. She swallowed hard. I used to think the world was divided into good and bad, light and dark. But now, I'm not sure it was ever that simple. It never was, he murmured. You just had the courage to see it. She looked at him, her chest tight. You make it sound like a virtue. It is, he said. It's what kept you alive. What kept all of us alive, even when we didn't deserve it. Hermione's throat felt tight. You always say things like that, as if you weren't worth saving. He turned his gaze toward the fire. Maybe I wasn't. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. You were. He looked at their hands, then at her face, his voice barely above a whisper. You really believe that? I wouldn't be here if I didn't. The air seemed to hold still. He reached for her hand fully then, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her wrist. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, he said softly. Neither do I, she admitted. But you want it? Yes. The word came out trembling, certain. He exhaled shakily. So do I. He leaned forward, slowly, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. Their lips met, soft at first, then deeper, surer. The kiss wasn't the collision of enemies, nor the tentative testing of something forbidden. It was a quiet surrender. When they broke apart, the world outside was still howling with wind, but inside, everything was warm. Hermione's voice was barely a whisper. Does this mean it's real now? He smiled faintly. It's been real for a long time. She rested her head against his shoulder, the rhythm of his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. Later, as the fire burned low, Hermione stirred, half asleep. What happens when the snow melts? She murmured. Draco brushed a curl from her forehead. Then we find out what comes next. And if the ministry interferes again? He smiled, tired but certain. Then we fight them, together this time. She smiled, her eyes drifting shut. Together. Draco sat there long after she fell asleep, his hand tracing slow circles along her back. He'd spent years believing he didn't deserve love, that redemption was something forever out of reach. But now, with her sleeping against him, he realized that perhaps redemption wasn't something granted. Perhaps it was something built, moment by fragile moment, between two people who had every reason to hate each other and somehow chose not to. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, quieting the world. Inside, for the first time, they were at peace. The snow melted slowly, reluctantly, as though winter was unwilling to surrender its hold. The air grew softer, the trees heavy with the scent of thawing earth. Inside the Wiltshire house, the fire still burned most evenings, though now it was out of comfort rather than necessity. Hermione had started leaving her books scattered across the sitting room. Draco didn't move them anymore. He said they made the place feel lived in. She teased that he just didn't want to risk being hexed for touching them, but in truth, she liked the way her world was beginning to bleed into his, the way his presence filled the empty spaces she hadn't realized existed. They had become, against every odd, something steady, something that felt like peace, even if neither dared to name it love again aloud. But peace, Hermione was learning, was fragile. The letter came on a Thursday, carried by a tawny owl that dropped it onto the breakfast table. Hermione was stirring her tea. Draco was halfway through a paragraph of the prophet when the owl's shadow crossed the paper. She opened it first, the ministry's seal glinting red under the morning light. Her eyes scanned the first lines, and her hand stilled. Draco frowned. "What is it?" "They're terminating the program," she said slowly, effective immediately. For a moment, there was only silence. Draco took the parchment, reading it twice before setting it down beside his untouched tea. His expression didn't change, but Hermione saw his knuckles whiten slightly. "So," he said finally, "that's it. It means the contracts are dissolved. All marriages under the Act are voluntary now. In other words," he said quietly, "you're free." She flinched at the word. "We both are." He nodded, but didn't meet her eyes. "Of course." The rest of the day moved like a dream she couldn't quite wake from. Hermione told herself it was what she had wanted. Freedom, the ability to choose. And yet the idea of walking away from this house, from him, made her chest ache. Draco withdrew into silence. He spent the afternoon in the garden, wand in hand, dismantling the protective wards one by one. Hermione watched from the window, each pulse of fading magic like a clock counting down. When he came back inside at dusk, snowmelt clinging to his boots, she couldn't take it anymore. "So, that's it?" she demanded. He looked up, startled. "What do you mean? You're just going to let it end like this?" He blinked. "What do you expect me to do, Hermione? Chain you here?" "That's not what You're free," he said again, harsher this time, as though he had to keep saying it to make it true. "You should be glad." "Glad," she repeated, the word trembling. "Is that what you are?" He didn't answer. "Say it," she whispered. "Say you're glad." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His voice, when it came, was rough. "I'm not." The admission broke something between them and freed something else. Hermione took a step forward. "Then what are you?" He exhaled sharply, turning away. Terrified, angry, relieved, all of it. Because if you stay now, it's no longer because you have to. And He stopped, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I deserve that." "Draco," she said softly, "you don't have to earn me." He looked at her then, the weight of months, of years, in his gaze. "You were supposed to hate me. It would have been easier." "Maybe," she said, "but easy isn't the same as right." They stood there for a long time, the space between them humming with everything that had led them here. Anger, forgiveness, longing, fear. Finally, she said, "If I stay, it's because I want to." His breath caught. "You'd do that?" "Yes." He shook his head, disbelief shadowing his face. "You don't understand what you're choosing." "I understand perfectly," she said. "I'm choosing you." The storm between them broke all at once. Draco moved before he thought, crossing the room in 2 strides, and she met him halfway. The kiss was fierce this time, a collision of everything they had fought against, months of restraint unraveling in a heartbeat. His hands tangled in her hair, hers in his shirt, and when they broke apart, neither could speak. They simply breathed, the same breath, the same trembling air. "Tell me this is real," he whispered. "It's real," she said, her voice shaking. "It always was." He laughed, a raw, disbelieving sound. "I don't know how to do this." "Then we'll learn," she said, "together." And he kissed her again. When morning came, sunlight spilled across the room, soft and golden. Hermione woke to find Draco still beside her, one arm draped over her waist, his breathing slow and steady. For a moment, she simply lay there, memorizing the quiet. It felt impossibly ordinary. The rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his skin. But ordinary was what she had missed most. He stirred after a while, blinking awake. His voice was rough with sleep. "Morning?" "Morning," she whispered back. He studied her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're still here." "Of course I am." He brushed a thumb across her cheek. "I half thought I'd dreamed you." She smiled softly. "Not this time." He exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. "I don't know what happens now." Hermione shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. "We build something new." He gave a faint laugh. "You make it sound easy." "It won't be," she admitted, "but it will be ours." Over the following days, the rhythm of their life changed subtly, almost imperceptibly. There were no more ministry letters, no more forced appearances, no more pretending. Hermione began rewriting the wards, not to keep anyone out, but to make the place feel like home. Draco helped her, though he still flinched sometimes when the magic flared bright, an old reflex from darker times. She'd touch his arm then, grounding him, and he'd breathe easier. They began to cook together in the evenings, though together mostly meant Hermione laughing, while Draco tried not to burn the stew. When he succeeded, she'd reward him with a kiss that left him momentarily speechless, and he'd mutter something about culinary witchcraft just to make her laugh again. It was fragile. It was imperfect. It was real. And as spring finally broke through the last of the frost, Hermione realized she was no longer counting the days since the war ended. She was counting the days they'd begun. One evening they stood in the garden, the sun sinking low behind the hills. The first flowers had begun to bloom, tiny, stubborn bursts of colour against the dark soil. Draco took her hand, tracing circles against her skin. You know, when they forced us into this, I thought it was punishment. Hermione smiled faintly. It was. He chuckled softly. Then how did it turn into this? Because we let it. He looked at her, something tender and unguarded in his eyes. You make it sound like magic. She squeezed his hand. It is. He leaned down, kissing her forehead. Thank you. For what? For staying. Hermione smiled. Always. And as twilight settled around them, Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger stood hand in hand, no longer bound by law, no longer enemies or symbols of anything larger than themselves. Just two people who had found, in each other, the fragile, impossible miracle of choosing love after war. Spring unfolded like a quiet spell, slow and deliberate, and with it, life began to weave its way back into the cracks the war had left behind. Wiltshire turned green again, fields rippling like silk in the breeze, wildflowers blooming along the edge of the path that led to their home. The house itself had changed too. Hermione could feel it every time she stepped through the door. Where once there had been cold silence, there was laughter now, and light, and the warmth of two lives slowly intertwining. But with peace came reflection, and with reflection came fear. She felt it one morning as she stood by the kitchen window, watching Draco work in the garden. He had shed the formality that used to define him. His sleeves rolled, his hands dusted with soil, sunlight catching in his hair. He looked human, and that terrified her, because she had loved ideals before, courage, justice, truth. But this was different. This was fragile, imperfect, real. This was a man who carried ghosts in his eyes, and yet made her tea every morning, a man who had once been her enemy and was now her home. Draco looked up then, as if he'd felt her gaze. You're staring again, Granger. Old habits, she said, smiling faintly as she stepped outside. He leaned on the spade, smirking. You could help, you know. I did my share of digging during the war. I think I've earned a lifetime exemption. Convenient. She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. You're terrible at this. At gardening? At pretending you're not happy. He paused, his smirk fading into something softer. You make it difficult not to be. Hermione's heart skipped. Careful, Malfoy. That almost sounded like a compliment. Don't get used to it. But she could hear the warmth beneath his teasing. The walls that had once defined him, pride, guilt, distance, had begun to crumble, and she loved watching them fall. That night, the air was cool and sweet. They sat by the fire, a bottle of wine between them, the flicker of flames dancing across their faces. Draco had been quiet all evening, his gaze distant. "What is it?" Hermione asked softly. He swirled the wine in his glass. "Do you ever think about how strange this is?" "This?" she echoed. "Us," he said. "You and me, the Golden Girl and the son of Death Eaters. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be here, I would have hexed them on principle." Hermione smiled, but her heart ached at the truth in his tone. Maybe that's what makes it matter more. He glanced at her. "You always have to find meaning in things, don't you? Someone has to." Draco chuckled quietly. "You sound like you're afraid to stop fighting." "Maybe I am," she admitted. "It's what I've always done. If I stop, I'll have to face what's left." He studied her, his expression softening. "You think what's left isn't enough?" Hermione hesitated. I don't know who I am without the cause." "You're the same person you've always been," he said. "You just finally have the chance to live for yourself." She blinked, caught off guard by the gentleness in his voice. "You're getting better at this." "At what?" "At saying things that make me want to cry." He reached across the small space between them, his hand finding hers. "Then cry, Hermione. You don't have to be the strong one all the time." The way he said her name undid her completely. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his shoulder. His arms came around her, steady and sure, and she let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in years. As days passed, life began to take shape again. Hermione returned to the ministry in a limited role, consulting on legislation and magical rites. Draco opened a small apothecary in the nearby village, discreet, elegant, specializing in potion ingredients and spellcraft. The first time she visited, she found him standing behind the counter, sleeves rolled, talking quietly to a young witch who looked terrified. He was patient with her, kind even. Hermione watched from the doorway, something in her chest twisting. After the girl left, Draco noticed her. "You're early." "I didn't know I needed an appointment." He smiled faintly. "Always the rule breaker." Hermione stepped closer, glancing around the shop. "It's beautiful." He shrugged. "It's small, but it's mine." She turned back to him. "You sound proud." "I am," he said simply, then with a wry smile. "You were right, you know." "I usually am." "About what, specifically?" "That there's life after the war. That it's not about redemption, it's about rebuilding." Her eyes softened. "You're getting very philosophical these days." "Don't tell anyone. It would ruin my reputation." She laughed, and the sound filled the quiet room like sunlight. That evening, when they returned home, Draco surprised her. "Come with me," he said suddenly, taking her hand. "To where?" "You'll see." He led her outside through the fields until they reached a small grove at the edge of the property. The moon hung low and full, silver light spilling across the grass. He stopped beneath an old oak tree and turned to face her. "I rebuilt the wards," he said. "But this time, they're ours." Hermione frowned. "Ours?" He nodded. "No ministry seals, no restrictions, just a promise, a space that's ours alone." He drew his wand and traced a faint arc through the air. Golden light flared between them, forming a circle that shimmered before fading into the ground. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly. "Bound the house, and us, to peace." As long as we're within these walls, nothing can touch us. Hermione's throat tightened. That's beautiful. It's not much. It's everything, she said. And before he could reply, she kissed him. Slow, reverent, a thank you that words couldn't hold. When they pulled apart, her eyes were bright with tears. You're not the boy I met all those years ago. No, he said quietly. And you're not the girl I used to hate. She smiled. Good. He brushed his thumb along her cheek. So what now, Granger? She took his hand, intertwining their fingers. Now we live. Weeks passed. The days grew warmer, filled with laughter and quiet contentment. Sometimes they fought, sharp words born from old habits, but they always found their way back to each other. And one evening, as they stood in the garden watching the sunset, Hermione realized something. The hatred that had once defined them was gone, replaced not by perfection, but by understanding. She turned to him, her voice soft. Do you ever think about what people would say if they knew? Draco smirked. They'd call you mad. And you. He looked at her, eyes full of quiet devotion. Lucky. Hermione smiled, her heart full. As the last light of day faded, they stood together in the twilight, two souls scarred by war, healed by love, and bound not by duty or law, but by choice. In the hush of spring's first evening, Hermione whispered the truth neither of them needed to hear aloud. They were home.